For 1,000 years, Europe prayed for rain. It fell in every blessing, in every harvest hymn, in every whispered hope over a newly planted field. Rain was not the enemy. Rain was God saying yes. So when the skies opened in the spring of 1315, no one was afraid. The farmers of England and France walked their fields the way their fathers had, scattering seed into the dark soil with quiet, unshaken faith, while the church bells marked the seasons as they always had. This was the rhythm of the world, and the world had never broken it. But that spring, something was different. The rain came, and then it did not stop. Week after week, the dark clouds pressed low over the land. The fields turned to swamp. Seeds rotted in the ground before they could ever sprout. Hay lay soaking and would not dry, and the barns filled with damp grain that turned green with mold. And here is what made this so deadly. Medieval farming lived on a razor's edge. For every single seed a family planted, they could hope to harvest only 3 or 4 in return. That was the entire margin between life and starvation, a civilization surviving on barely 25% above nothing. Every family knew the dangerous weeks of early summer, the stretch they called the hungry gap, when last year's food ran thin and this year's was not yet ready. In 1315, that gap opened, and it never closed again, because by then, there was only one food left that a family could still eat, and to eat it was to kill the year that had not yet come. And that summer, the most powerful man in England would sit down to a table with no bread on it at all. Famine does not break down the door. It is invited in, one smaller meal at a time. At first, no family called it starvation. They simply cut the bread a little thinner, watered the porridge down until it was more water than grain, and saved every crumb that fell from the table, certain the next harvest would set things right. When that was not enough, they began to sell the very things that kept them alive. Livestock that should have carried them through winter was slaughtered early, tools were traded away, clothing, and finally land itself. All of it exchanged for a few desperate handfuls of grain. And then they reached the last food in the house, the seed grain meant for spring. Remember the arithmetic. Every seed eaten now was 3 or 4 loaves erased from a harvest that would never be planted. They were not eating grain, they were eating the future. Across England, the price of wheat climbed to many times what it had been just months before. The coins were still in people's hands, but there was nothing left to buy with them, and the cost went deeper than any ledger could measure. Children stopped growing. The old faded first. A small fever, a minor wound, became a death sentence in bodies already emptied of strength. Perhaps the most haunting thing was the sound, or the absence of it. The villages fell silent. No lowing of cattle, no children running between the houses, only the endless dripping of rain. Scientists now know that prolonged hunger reshapes the mind itself, dulling judgment and quietly smothering empathy. Neighbors who had shared everything began to bolt their doors. Theft crept in where trust had been. And so, in that first year, the famine began to unstitch the invisible threads that had always held people to one another. By 1316, the fields lay empty, not because no one would work them, but because there was nothing left to plant. The machinery of survival had broken down entirely. The oxen that pulled the heavy ploughs had died of disease and starvation, and the ploughs themselves sat abandoned in the mud, rusting where they had been dropped. And if you think hunger only touched the poor, remember this. In August of 1315, the King of England himself, Edward II, stopped at the town of St. Albans, and his servants could not find bread to set before him. Let that settle for a moment. If a crown could not buy bread, what could a starving peasant possibly offer? Yet the lords still came for their rents, demanding their share from villages that had nothing left to give. The whole feudal order began to crack, because power in medieval Europe was built on land, and land only ever meant one thing: food. When the food vanished, authority was revealed for what it had always been: a promise. The church faced the same impossible test. Monasteries threw open their granaries and fed the hungry until the very last measure of grain was gone. And then they closed their gates, not from cruelty, but from simple arithmetic. They could no longer save everyone. And beneath it all ran a deeper terror. These were people who believed that famine was the judgment of God, a punishment for sin. But if this was punishment, then whose sin was so great? Some whispered that even the king had been forsaken by heaven. That question ate at the soul of Europe from the inside. Then, in 1317, the rain finally began to ease. But the cruelest blow had not yet fallen. People do not suddenly become cruel, they become desperate. And to understand what desperation did to medieval Europe, you have to understand what starvation does to a human body. First, it burns through fat. Then it begins to consume muscle, the very strength a person needs to survive another day. Every step across a field cost more energy than the body had left to give. Modern medicine explains what the chroniclers could only watch in horror. Prolonged hunger collapses the body's hormones, cripples the immune system, and starves the brain itself. As blood sugar falls, judgment blurs and emotion fades, until the raw instinct to survive begins to overpower everything a person once believed about right and wrong. And so they ate whatever remained. They boiled the leather of their own shoes, stripped bark from the trees, and clawed frozen roots from the ground. They baked bread from mold. And in a handful of the darkest accounts, the chroniclers hint at families who crossed the final line no human should ever have to face. But here is the truth that surprises almost everyone. Hunger itself was rarely the killer. Most who died were taken by disease, by infections that a strong, well-fed body would have easily survived. Starvation did not swing the blade. It simply opened the door and let sickness walk through. And still, people would not stop hoping. Whole families abandoned their homes and took to the roads, chasing rumors of grain in some distant town, and most of them never arrived. They did not die because they gave up, they died because they hoped. In the end, the Great Famine revealed something we would rather not know. The final battle was never against the sky. It was against the instinct hidden inside ourselves. In 1317, the sun returned. Europe did not celebrate. It simply counted. The fields were sown once more, but there were far fewer hands to sow them. Entire villages had vanished from the map, and the farmland that once fed them slipped quietly back into forest and marsh, erasing every trace that anyone had ever worked that soil. And just when survivors dared to believe the worst was behind them, the cruelest blow of all arrived. Between 1319 and 1321, a great plague swept through the cattle of northern Europe, killing off most of the oxen that had somehow endured the hunger. The rain had stopped years ago, the dying had not. But the deepest wound was one that could never be counted, because what the famine truly destroyed was knowledge. The experienced farmers who could read the weather, the skilled craftsmen, the midwives, the elders who carried generations of hard-won wisdom, all of them were gone, and with them died the children who should have inherited everything they knew. And for those who lived, the scars ran into the bone, quite literally. An entire generation grew up shorter, weaker, and more prone to sickness for the rest of their lives. The famine did not end in 1317. It lived on inside the bodies of those born after it. It lived on in memory too, for the villages remembered with terrible precision which lord still demanded his rent, which monastery shared its final grain, and which neighbour bolted the door. That memory reshaped Europe for generations. It was here, in these years, that trust itself began to die, and barely a generation later, the Black Death would fall upon a continent that had never truly healed. Because history is rarely undone in a single dramatic moment. It fades through countless impossible choices. One failed harvest, one empty barn, one family choosing between today and tomorrow. So the question was never how Europe survived. The question is what survival costs, and whether we ourselves are living on a margin any thinner than that fragile 25%. Dark Origins will take you deeper into the story's history almost left behind,